And if anybody's interested in working with me in that area, let me know, because if the company takes off, I'm gonna need a bunch of people to work, gonna be working with me. So here's the other question that I got the other day. I was asked to make a formal presentation to a group of academicians, okay? And what they asked me to do was to do the economic analysis on the gig economy. Does everybody understand what the gig economy is? Yeah, it's basically, you know, I got laid off, I can't get a real job.
Like 10 jobs, right?
So now I got 10 jobs, you know, driving for Uber, Lyft, TaskRabbit, you know, there's some other ones like that. I basically piece together my income.
We can write on there too.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was conduct an economic analysis on the gig economy and present that to us. This was from the academicians. Okay. So I thought about it for a little bit. I spent one night sleeping on it, and then I spent all day Sunday working on it, and finally finished the presentation on Monday morning. So it took me, I don't know, 13 hours or something to kind of figure it out. And this was the presentation that I gave. So I'm going to walk you through it, okay, so you can see it. Because this is an economics class, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the gig economy and the trends in employment away from traditional employment towards gig employment is going to have an impact on urban land use? Well, what happened when what happened when Uber came? What happened to the taxi industry?
All the taxi offices were.
Yeah, what happened to the number of taxis in the downtown? Yeah, it shrunk significantly. What happened to the number of drivers that were working for Uber and Lyft? Yeah, exploded, okay? Created more pollution, more congestion pricing, all kinds of issues, okay? Excuse me. So I was asked to do the analysis. So I want you to see, since this is an economics class, how an economist thinks. Okay.
Is this? I probably answered it, but I was just curious. Is because of like all the Ubers and all that, that just takes away from. They only need one office. They don't need multiple like locations for like.
Uber.
Yeah, like they don't.
Central location.
Yeah.
They do all of the. They built the software application that basically not only hires and manages the employment for the gig workers, but also has the technology to basically match up the drivers with the customers through an application. So they basically run the technology platform, okay? And then you have the drivers, right? And then you have the customers. So those are the three people, and then you have the industry structure. It was basically ride-hauling services, taxi services, was a highly regulated industry. Uber basically blew up that business model because it was deregulated, and it flooded the system, and it was technologically disruptive. Okay, and then theoretically the customers have an application that makes it easier to basically hail ride-hauling services. But let me kind of walk you through the economics. Okay. Did I answer kind of your?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I'll answer all your questions. Okay. So let's get through, what the goal of the presentation is. It was to present a real-world application in macro and microeconomic data and analysis and the impact of the gig economy. So here's basically how I set up the outline. I actually took some stuff from this presentation and put it into the other presentation, so I cheated. So the way I set it up was an introduction, the definition of the gig economy. Then I looked at the global economics, because the gig economy, you have to be adept to using technology through your handheld to be able to get your gig work, right? So areas where people are adept to using technology and applications are probably gonna be those where gig workers are gonna be adopted quicker. That's an assumption. So here are basically the geographies that I looked at, are the urban economics that I analyzed. Innovative cities, states with high technology and science, knowledge employment, we already saw that, co-working space, areas that have co-working space, and then fastest growing gig workforce map. And then the gig economics. I looked at consumer preferences, supply and demand for gig labor, the Ricardian or rents or the monopoly profits, so doing industry analysis, looking at deadweight loss, both producer and consumer. This should all bring back nightmares of your microeconomics class, asymmetric information, and public policy. How do you cure for market failures? Well, you cure it through government policy. And then just some conclusions. So let's do an introduction. And my belief is that technological innovation is disrupting traditional economic, political, and labor market relationships between employers, workers, and consumers. However, the true disruption in innovation is coming from the change in adoption of individual thought. It's not the technology that creates revolutions. It's how people change the way they think. It's ideological change, okay? And your generation is gonna be moving forward over the next 30, 40 years with the revolution in individual thought. It's the technology that enables the revolution in your ability to be innovative and creative. It's the technology that enables it, but it's you who is creative and innovative at the end. So what are some of the high takeaways here? So the number of people in the US working on demand in gig jobs to grow from 4 million in 2016 to 9 million by next year, okay? So, double. The share of workforce in the gig economy rose from 10% in 2005 to now 16%. And probably more because this was as of 2015. In 2016, 24% of Americans were earning some income from the digital platform economy. I actually believe from the conclusion of this analysis that somebody's gonna come up with a labor marketplace, basically like an eBay, not for gig workers. Gig workers will be one application, but also for highly skilled and highly educated individuals. So I'm out of a job, big deal. I go onto the marketplace and I have people bid on my labor. So maybe I want X, but I want to make some money. I got the credentials, somebody bids on me. So basically my labor is not being negotiated in a private contract between me and the employer. My market value is being bid on in an open marketplace, and people can bid on my labor and I can accept whatever contract that I want. It's currently happening through contract, employers, but not in an open marketplace. That's actually occurring right now through an application. So I think that's what's gonna happen. This gig thing is gonna then jump to highly skilled individuals. And there'll be an application in the marketplace for that, just like an Uber for transit. This will be an Uber for intellectual property, intellectual skills. The number of employed individuals, independent workers in the gig economy rose 19% from 2005 to 15. From 2005 to 15, gross receipts of independent workers grew 21%. And the South saw the largest growth of self-employed individuals at 21%, and the West at 21%. So my question was, when I looked at it, it's like, why was the South so quick to adopt this type of technology? Can anybody guess why the South would adopt this gig economy and the gig platforms so quicker than other areas of the country?
Was it because there's more people that are unemployed over there?
There's racial discrimination there. So you have huge populations of African Americans in particular that have been subjected to institutional racism. And the unemployment rates and incarceration rates are really high in the South. So you have a huge pool of labor that's sitting there idle just based on race. So by using technology, it creates equity. It levels the playing field through the technology to allow these people that otherwise couldn't find jobs through regular job search. They now can use these platform technologies to find work. Maybe it's not high income work, but it's a heck of a lot more than they were making before. So in the end, they're better off. That's the only thing I can think of, which I thought was really fascinating. The gig economy is replacing traditional working relationships between the employee and the employer, replacing standardized work contracts with flexible virtual work contracts. 1/3 of the working population are gig workers. That's pretty big. Right? So this is what we're looking at. This is a major transformation in labor markets. And it's still early, right, in the adoption phase. It's still early in the restructuring phase of the labor market. As employers and employees look for more flexible work environments, enabled by new networking technology, gig work environments will continue to replace traditional employer-worker relationships. Gig work is having a profound impact on labor markets. Workers are being paid less for receiving less benefits than traditional workers. However, and this is the part I didn't figure out, I didn't quantify to figure out how to actually do the present value and the net present value calculations. I know that they're getting paid less, but what is the value of more leisure time? What is the value of more flex time? What is the value of being able to do other things and being in control of your work schedule? I don't know that question, but I could probably sit down and try to put some monetary value around it. But that was the part that was weak in my analysis. However, workers are more free to work their own hours, work for employers of choice, and can determine their own workloads and type of work they choose. There's got to be some benefits to that, but I just don't know how to quantify it. Flexible work is allowing the employers and workers to choose and to scale workloads in a dynamic way, benefiting both. Due to lower costs of employment, employers are more profitable, and workers have more time for work or leisure, making them both better off. That's an assumption. It's too early, we don't know, but that's the assumption. So what's the definition? Those were like the major takeaways. So let's step back and let's kind of get into the definition so we can do the market analysis. So the gig economy is made up of temporary flexible jobs, independent contractors, and freelancers. And actually this market, even though it's new, has now been disrupted again, because the new legislation in the state of California basically states that if you're a gig worker, independent contractor, working for Uber, basically what they did was they said, Uber, you got to make them employees and provide them with benefits. So now California state legislation has disrupted the labor market for the gig economy, and I don't know what the implications and ramifications are. From what I've heard, some of the gig workers don't want to be employees, they want the flexible time. So what they're going to have to do is create limited liability corporations and basically operate as an LLC or C Corp to circumvent the legislation. Disrupts traditional full-time work arrangements, connects workers with clients or customers through online platforms. Gig workers could be adjunct professors, drivers, waiters, service workers, remote workers. Companies are like Uber, Airbnb, Lyft, Etsy, and then they act as a medium where workers connect to and are ultimately paid by the customer. Okay? And make it easier for workers to find quick and temporary work. So the question was also, what was the macroeconomic effects of this gig work? So when you're talking about macroeconomic effects, you're talking about externalities. So what are the positive externalities associated with this new gig economy, and then what are the negative externalities? So the positive externalities that I found was that the gig economy benefits workers through online access. They don't have to do physical search. They can now use the application and the online technology to be able to access the work. Businesses are more cheaper and efficient. They're flatter. They don't have to have all these bureaucracies. And customers have online access through the handheld devices and through the online access. By making work adaptable to demand of the moment and flexible lifestyles. You get another positive externality is you have greater freedom of choice, wider range of applicants. So the employer now has 100,000 applicants instead of 100 applicants. And gig employers take on less economic risk. If I'm Uber and the economy goes down, I scale down. I don't hire as many gig workers. I don't have to lay people off. So I can scale up, I can scale down based on the economic cycle. And actually the workers themselves can scale up and scale down and can supply drivers to the marketplace based on peak demand or cyclical demand. So it's a lot easier to meet the flows, not only daily peak loads, but also seasonal loads and cyclical loads. It's very flexible as an employer to be able to scale your workforce very rapidly. So that means that that means that the employer takes on less economic risk, and the economic risk is put onto the driver, onto the gig worker. That's called intertemporal substitution. That's a substitution effect. Changing market trends and consumer preferences. Again, the employer is now offloaded economic risk, market risk, changing markets, and consumer preference changes. That's huge to be able to do that. So that's why these companies are so profitable. That's why Uber is worth billions of dollars, because they can do this stuff. What are the negative externalities associated with the gig economy? The downside is the erosion in traditional economic relationships. And there's online price discrimination. Not racial discrimination, but price discrimination. I can charge more for my labor during peak hours, around 5 o'clock and between 10 and 12 o'clock on Friday and Saturday night. So I can come into the marketplace and I can sell my labor at a higher price. If the demand falls, I can scale my time down. I can go in and I can still sell my labor, but my labor's got to be higher than break even. Okay. Here's a perfect example. You go up to Tahoe. I was just up there, South Lake Tahoe. I was there after Christmas, during the week. I couldn't get an Uber. If I was there on a Friday, Saturday night when everybody from Sacramento goes up there, to go drinking at the clubs, right, and gamble, I'd be able to there'd be more Uber drivers because the pay went up enough, so now it's above their break even and they actually are in a profit zone. Okay. I thought that was kind of interesting. Another negative externality is workers looking for traditional careers, stability, security, particularly health benefits, are being crowded out by specific industries. This disrupts work-life balance. Some of these gig workers are working a lot of hours, so they don't get a lot of sleep. It's disrupting their daily life, and it's creating huge opportunity and surge costs for traditional jobs. Maybe they're doing it, to make some money, but they're looking for traditional jobs. They can't find a traditional job, so they're stuck in the gig economy. Gig workers take on more economic risk, changing market trends and consumer preferences. So instead of the employer, it's the worker who's taking that on. Long-term economic transactions and relationships between workers and employers and clients and vendors are eroding. So when you work for a traditional company, you're working with clients, building long-term relationships, okay, which is part of the brand and part of the value. But with the gig economy, they're short-term relationships that are being eroded. So that's going to have an effect on the brand and could have an effect on the relationship with the customers. And then falling capital investment in relationship-specific assets due to lack of incentives to build long-term, long-lasting relationships. So basically, I'm a company, I want to invest in you to build in systems around you, to build long-lasting relationships with the customers, to generate revenue, to generate sales. If these are eroding, then there's opportunity costs that are now starting to be introduced. There's asymmetric information because the client doesn't know what the company wants from them because there's huge turnover in who is representing the company. So the customer's being dissatisfied, and then the company itself basically doesn't know how to sell to the customer because the salesperson turnover is really high. So the company's not going to invest in systems or in individuals because the structure of the labor market has changed so radically. So if you look at the urban economics, we kind of went through this. Where is the gig economy going to be adopted the quickest? And who's going to utilize these technological platforms? Right? It's going to be the core innovative cities. And that's where Uber went first, right? What's the major cities in the US? The coastal markets. And what I was surprised about was how fast the gig workers were being work was being generated in the South, and I'll show you in a minute. We've already seen this. Here's the gig workers. Depending on what type of work you're doing, you're going to need space, right? Office space. So here, this kind of gives you an idea. This is a co-working space. And you can see the co-working space over 10 years has been growing exponentially as people start to take on more gig type work. They need a place to work. They can work virtually. They can work from their home, or they can rent a WeWork space and go work out of the WeWork space. And then here's the gig worker growth map. This is called a thematic map that basically shows you the rate in which gig workers are growing the fastest. So obviously, the coastal areas, and just look at LA. LA has some big counties, but obviously LA is a huge freaking market, right? With a lot of people. And this just basically has brought out huge labor pools, enabling people that otherwise were stuck, not making any money, or not having opportunity to make money, now have the technological platforms to be engaged, in the gig work environments. You have the South. It would be interesting to see what Mexico looks like, right? It probably spills over into the maquiladoras and into Tijuana. Then you have Texas, and look, here's the South. Huge cluster, thematics, huge growth in Florida. And then up the western seaboard, the mid-Atlantic, and then here in the middle of the country, up into Montana and Wyoming. So I think it's kind of interesting when you look at the, obviously the Pacific Northwest, obviously California, up into, Texas, San Antonio, not much in New Mexico, Utah, Texas, all throughout the South, and then up the eastern seaboard. So let's look at the economics. So what I did was I said, okay, let's look at the production function. Let's use the production possibility frontier to get kind of a macro view of what's going on. So let's say you have two goods, okay? I want housing, right? So we're going to produce housing. This is a two-good continuum. We're producing housing and we're producing transportation services. If I want more housing, I'm going to have to give up production of transportation. To produce more housing, I'm going to have to produce less transportation. If I want more transportation, I'm going to have to produce less housing. Okay, it's just the economy's ability to actually produce these goods. Okay. But to be able to produce more of both, the production function or the production possibility frontier needs to shift out. And the only way that it shifts out is through technological innovation. So now we can produce more housing by automating the production of basically physical walls of the homes. I can now use automated manufacturing to basically produce more materials very efficiently to produce more housing through technological advancement. I can now produce more transportation through Uber and Lyft type applications. So it actually shifts it out. So technological innovation right now is actually shifting out the production function to allow for more production of not only housing, but also transportation. Now, consumers want more transportation and consumers want more housing. So if you're producing less housing and less transportation, the consumer is worse off. But if you can produce more housing and more transportation, then as you produce more, the utility curves, the individual consumer's utility, they are better off. So as you can produce more, the consumer is better off. The consumer wants to be here. They don't want to be here, and they don't want to have to trade off transportation here to consume more housing, or trade off housing here to consume more transportation. So if you look at it from a consumption budget, where you're constrained by your budget. You can only consume so much of anything, right? Based on the amount of money that you make. So I want housing and I want transportation. If I want more transportation, I'm going to have to substitute housing consumption for transportation consumption. And think about it, people do that, don't they? I want to move to San Francisco so I don't have to drive. So basically I'm going to reduce my transportation consumption to increase my housing consumption. I want to move to the suburbs so that I can, live there. So I'm going to have to substitute on the housing, the proximity, the convenience of the housing to basically buy more transportation. So the substitution of that is basically you're constrained by your consumption budget at your utility curve, and basically you just trade off what your preference is. Ideally, you want to consume both, and the only way to do that is to make more money through the income effect. So you end up consuming more housing, more transportation, because you make more money, and your utility curve moves up to a higher level, so you're better off in the long run. Okay, let's look at some other economics. So let's look at the labor market, okay, for traditional workers and for taxi drivers, okay? So this is a scenario where you have elastic demand. This is a scenario where you have inelastic demand. Same supply shock, but one curve is more elastic, the other curve is more inelastic. So here, you have when the supply shock of labor hits, the quantity supplied increases and wages drop. This is more for the traditional worker. And these wages, right here, are very sticky. It's not a pure auction market because you have labor contracts. So as the supply shock hits, the quantity supplied will shift out, wages will drop, but wages will drop only so far because of the rigidity in the marketplace. But the demand curve for taxi drivers, currently, when the supply of labor hit with all these gig workers coming in, since the demand curve was so inelastic, their wages fell quickly and further, very rapidly, because their demand curve was inelastic. The traditional workers' demand curve was elastic.
Would there be many of those people that have like transitioned from a taxi driver to an Uber driver for that reason? Would they get, would a taxi driver transition over to an Uber driver to get paid more or something like that in that regard?
Well, that's part of the problem here, is if you look at the historical taxi driver market, it was highly regulated. Most of the workers were unionized. The city controlled the supply of taxis and the number of taxi drivers. So they actually constrained the supply to prop up the fares, so that they made the fares more expensive. And then because the taxi drivers were making such good money over a lifetime, that the city decided to ration the medallions that basically you needed to have to be able to drive the taxi. And they sold these medallions for $100,000. So you had to generate X amount of money over a certain period of time to be able to pay for the $100,000. And when the taxi market was regulated, the taxi drivers made enough to be able to pay back the money that they spent to buy the medallions. Once Uber came in and disrupted the market, taxi drivers, the cost structures of the taxi market were way too high and they couldn't compete against Uber, and the taxi drivers went bankrupt. And a lot of taxi drivers right now, a lot of them committed suicide because they just can't pay back the medallions. People aren't using taxis, they're using Uber, so there's not enough demand for their services. So it's a market that's been completely disrupted by deregulation. And there was a lawsuit that was filed, I think this week or last weekend, to basically sue the city and county of San Francisco to basically get the money back and pay back the cab drivers for the amount of money that they paid for the medallions, because it was the city in the county that allowed Uber to come in unregulated to disrupt their market and dislocate them. Yes.
I don't know how sustainable it is, but I know in New York you can summon a cab on Uber. Is that like,
Say that again?
in New York you can summon a cab on Uber?
Yeah, they have their own applications.
Yeah, but like it's on the Uber app though, you can get a cab.
You probably,
Yeah.
but the taxi cab industry in these cities is still regulated, where Uber is not regulated. So the question is, why do you have one entrance, one participant that's operating in a deregulated environment, and you have another industry that's operating in a regulated market?
Can they not regulate Uber at all?
They can't, they just don't want to.
I know at airports they charge them to get in now.
Yeah, there's changes that are going on. I mean, in some countries where labor laws are really strong, they're either not letting Uber in or they're restricting the amount of operations that Uber, because they want the taxi drivers. They believe in labor, they believe in labor unions, right? They believe in benefits, you know, for these taxi drivers in these unions under this regulated market structure. So the US is more liberal of an economic environment than a corporatist environment or a social welfare state or a social structure in some other countries. Countries have different social economic structures, social political structures, different types of priorities that they have in their, ours is laissez-faire, ours is very liberal. They'll allow for market disruption to occur. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else?
Has the amount of taxi drivers allowed to be given medallions increased with the population growth of?
They
New York
were,
City? Okay,
they were,
Did it
but
match
not
it?
now.
oh, okay,
No, because they were always constraining it
sure, so it's like
to
artificially.
allow for, I got the economics, so
Interesting, yeah.
I'll walk through that.
Yeah,
Okay, so the takeaway from this was, as more gig workers enter the market, real wages fall for traditional workers. Because the demand curve is elastic. Okay? But real wages fall more for taxi drivers because the demand curve is inelastic. I'm getting to your answers on monopolies and those things. So the second one was, here's an elastic supply curve with a demand shock. Here's the inelastic supply curve with a negative demand shock. I was trying to, you know, instead of using this as a theoretical illustration, I was actually trying to apply the economics to the case study. Okay. So the takeaway here was rising demand for gig workers, right? So as the demand curve shifted out and the quantity demanded shift out, wages actually, real wages actually increased, but didn't increase a lot, okay? If it was in a more regulated market, right, where you had a more inelastic supply curve, if the demand shock hit, wages would have rose very quickly, okay? But rising demand for gig workers has had modest positive effect on real wages because the labor supply curve for gig labor is elastic. And over here, demand and real wages for traditional workers, particularly taxi drivers, have fallen significantly because the labor supply curve for traditional workers and taxi drivers is inelastic. So because of the regulation of taxi drivers, their supply and demand curves were very inelastic, where the labor markets were very elastic and could respond. I thought that was interesting that the taxi driver labor market had both inelastic demand curve and inelastic supply curve. So it totally makes sense. When a deregulated entity comes in and disrupts it, that industry segment or that labor market segment is going to get hurt the most because their supply and demand curves are inelastic.
So, for the taxi drivers, the whole reason they weren't able to like make it, I guess, make an adjustment to just being a taxi driver to a gig worker is because they have these medallions
Yeah, they were trapped.
trapped. Okay.
Yeah. They were trapped because they needed to pay off the medallions. So, and if they did, they'd have to file for bankruptcy. And that ruins your credit, right? You can't buy a home, you can't do a lot, your interest rates go up. So they were kind of trapped, you know, in a losing situation. That's why the suicide rates were so high.
They just didn't do anything.
Yeah, they were just, you know, that's it. Total desperation. And that's, when you have these kind of market failures, you have to have government intervention to basically come in and cure the market failures.
Because they're the ones that have the power to do it.
Yeah, they're the only ones who have the power and the budget to do it. So yes, okay, you know, 25 million bucks, I get 25, let's say, I get 250, you know, 250 taxi drivers, you know, that have bought these medallions. Why don't I just, you know, take 25 million from the general budget, or, you know, impose a tax, or, you know, raise a bond fund, you know, and pay off the taxi drivers and cure the market failure and get them out, which is what they'll probably end up doing. But the legislature didn't propose to cure those market failures through legislation. It has to be done through redress through the court system. So the taxi drivers are basically suing the city to try to get the money out of them, because they basically said, if you let Uber come in to disrupt, you know, our livelihood, then you guys are responsible to pay us back for the benefits. It's only fair, and they'll probably win. Okay. So the next is, if you're a firm, this is how you look at it. So these are the marketplaces, the network marketplace firms. Now, because their labor costs are so low, their average costs have come down. And what they'll do is they set the price at their marginal revenue. So where the marginal revenue hits the marginal cost curve is the price. This is the profits that they're gonna make between the marginal revenue and the price and the marginal cost curve to the average cost curve. This is the profits that they make. Here are the taxi. This is the taxi industry, hotels, unions, the publishing industry. As labor costs have gone up, their cost curves have risen, their profit margins have shrunk, and in some case, the average cost curves are either at the marginal cost, marginal revenue curve, or above it, boom, they're bankrupt. Another way to look at it, sorry, I wanted to do this one. The takeaway from this is owners of low-cost labor gig workers, which are the gig guys, and medium-cost land, because basically, me as Uber, that's all I gotta do is basically I got my app to get my gig workers. I don't have employees, so my costs are really low. In my real estate is cheap, because that's all I'm doing is basically buying co-located computation from the data center REITs to do my computational loads. So the real estate's really cheap. And I don't need a lot of workers that actually work for Uber, so my footprint, my rent's really cheap too. So that's why they're highly profitable companies. That's the business model. Okay. So the next one is, here's your supply curve, here's your demand curve, here's your equilibrium price. Okay. Now, at the equilibrium price, in a unregulated market, the point between this whole piece right here is consumer surplus. Okay, so the consumer's better off. This whole piece right here is producer surplus. So here's what happened, is the taxi driver industry was regulated. So basically the government imposed a tax, driving up the fares for taxi rides. By increasing the taxi ride due to higher taxes, it actually lowered the quantity of taxi services actually provided, and it was the city that captured this portion of the consumer surplus and this portion of the producer surplus, creating a deadweight loss for both the consumers and the producers. So the cost, the tax that was imposed, the cost of the medallions, the regulation and the unionization of the taxi industry created deadweight loss through higher prices and falling demand.
And deadweight loss is to say that it's less efficient than it could be?
Yeah, so
With both
without the
places.
tax in the medallions,
Sure.
the consumer would be better off because they would have this portion right here of consumer surplus, because the prices are lower, they'd have more money in their pocket. And the producer surplus here, they would actually be making more money. So they're both better off. But since the city regulated the taxi industry, imposed taxation and other regulations, it drove up the cost of the fares and reduced the quantity of transportation actually provided in the taxi industry, and they absorbed this consumer surplus, this triangle here, the consumer and producer in surplus is the tax that went to the government, creating a deadweight loss. So the producer and the consumer are worse off. Okay?
So this also didn't like, because that's another reason why people just would rather choose like Uber over like a.
Yeah, because there was higher cost and there was less services. I mean, you're out there trying to hail a cab,
Yeah.
right? And there's not enough cabs on the street. There was complaints for decades that there's never enough cabs on the street. Well, they wanted to restrict the amount of supply of cabs to be able to drive up the fares, to then be able to, so that the taxi industry was making monopoly profits, okay? So that the taxi drivers could pay for the medallions.
Yeah, and because like a taxi cab fare is ridiculously high in comparison to Uber, so no wonder people are also just making that switch. Because like for example, from the airport to like here, it's like a $75 like cab ride, whereas it's like a $15-20 Uber. You know?
Yeah, but after I did this analysis, I realized some things that I thought was really interesting. The companies can basically exploit the workers because they have information that the workers don't have, the riders don't have. They have basically information. The gig drivers have asymmetric information. They don't really understand the cost structures that the company is operating under, but the company does. So the company can make profits off that asymmetric information by having better information than the drivers. And then what I came to realize is that the drivers have better information than the customers. And here's an example of that. I was in the city probably a month ago, sitting on, in front of the Balboa Cafe, at like 11, 12 o'clock at night on a Saturday night, prime time, right? Prime time. Everybody's trying to get to where they need to go between basically 11 and 12 o'clock, 10 and 12 o'clock, that's prime time. I was trying to get an Uber to take me up to Marin. I would get a bid, I would get somebody to take me, and then the person would cancel. I would get another, then the driver would cancel. Then I would get another, and the driver would cancel. It took me 4 times to get a driver. What I figured out is that the drivers collude with each other. And that what they do is during peak load times, they cancel rides to bid up the Uber rate. And then they take once the rates are adjusted upwards, then they take the rides. So they basically have inside information and they collude on pricing of Uber fares.
So when they cancel, that's why.
Damn, I got schemed
So
on.
when they cancel, and actually that signals,
They're plotting.
that's a
That sucks.
signaling. So it's like an oligopoly, it's a monopolistic competition, competitive environment, where basically you have participants in the marketplace that are signaling other participants in the marketplace that it's now time, the loads are so high that you can safely turn down rides to then game the system to bid up the fares. And then once the fares are bid up
You can capture
at the
that.
peak, then you start to take the rides.
And so every time you would get it canceled and
Would it get
re-enter again.
It would be a little bit higher.
Would be, that's what I thought.
So what they're using is the system to collude on fares. So the drivers have better information
Yeah.
than the customers, the company has better information than the drivers.
No, it's not.
Okay, so what was
No
the,
way.
so
You're back.
the major takeaway from that was taxation, the cost of medallions, regulation, unionization, created less output. And deadweight loss for consumers and producers. For the taxi industry, eventually driving them out of business. So let's look at it from a monopolistic standpoint. Now, obviously, when you study monopolies, there's only one producer that provides the services or provides the provision of the good, and then can restrict the amount of supply to be able to create the monopoly profits. So here's your price and quantity, that's obviously your demand curve. There's your marginal revenue curve. Here's your average cost curve, right? And then this point right here is your monopoly profits, right there. So as taxi service go out of business, Uber, Lyft becomes a monopoly, right? So it was the taxi drivers that was the monopoly at one point. They basically drove out the taxi industry and now are in control of restricting supply. So it's not a monopoly position, it's more of a oligopoly, or it's a monopolistic competition. So you only have a few competitors within the marketplace. It's not an oligopoly, like a cartel, but it's more monopolistic competition. So as taxi drivers go out of business, Uber, Lyft becomes the monopoly in the market and can raise prices in a multi-part congestion pricing scheme.
This is just explaining what you were just talking about.
Exactly.
Canceling fit.
Yeah. So I was just talking about congestion pricing.
Mhm.
So as there's more demand, I can raise my prices. A multi-part system basically means I have a tiered pricing structure based on demand, or the segmentation in the demand, or in geographic location. So there's multi-part pricing schemes, or congestion pricing. Okay. On services generating monopoly profits. So do you think Uber is generating monopoly profits?
100%.
Absolutely. Okay, here's the other way to look at it. Okay, here's the other way to look at it. So here's your marginal cost curve, right here. That's where you should be. So there's your deadweight loss, right here. So when the monopoly restricts the supply, it increases the price. The profits go to the monopolist, and the deadweight loss is what the consumer incurs. Okay? So monopolization of previously competitive market caused output to be reduced. Blah, blah, blah. So the major takeaway here is monopoly profits for the firm are a deadweight loss for the consumer. I'm almost done. The next is asymmetric information. So this is what I was talking about earlier. Involves a considerable amount of uncertainty and can lead to inefficiency when one side has better information. Uber and Lyft have better production information about the actual cost structures of their company. The workers have better market information on supply and demand for prices. Asymmetric information, again, is one side has better information, private information, the employer and the worker. So Uber has better cost structure information than the worker has better price information than the consumer. There's also principal-agent problems. So the principal is Uber, the gig worker is the agent. The agent is the contract worker. So this is the party who decides whether or not to accept the contract, and then performs under the terms of the contract as an independent contractor. Typically, the party with the asymmetric information, in this case, is going to be the worker and the consumer. So you have two economic behavioral problems. First, you have moral hazard and adverse selection. And this is what you've seen with these Uber workers. The agent's actions affect the principal, but the principal does not observe the actions directly. Uber was hiring as many drivers as they could as fast as they could. They didn't care that they had criminal records or, other types of issues. They just wanted to hire them, so they weren't underwriting these individuals. And it was only until recently that they found out that X thousands or X percent of the Uber gig workers were actually sexually harassing and sexually assaulting their customers. So the workers exhibited risky behavior or bad behaviors after the fact once they were contracted. This was a lack of underwriting by Uber. Uber didn't screen the workers, didn't do any criminal background checks or any monitoring. So there was a moral hazard. So once the workers were hired, because they didn't do any underwriting, the workers started acting bad. So that's actually affected their brand. The adverse selection is the agent has private information. I'm a bad guy, okay, right? But Uber selects me because they think I'm good. So I show them my credit score, right? But I'm still kind of a bad person. I have a good credit score, I've never got arrested, but I'm still a bad person. But Uber doesn't do enough background information check on me, so they select me anyway to drive for them. And then something happens. So that's called adverse selection, when you're basically picking bad credit or bad individuals. So the agent has private information before signing the contract. So this is a hidden type model. So workers hide the bad, risky behaviors of their past.
So how is Uber protected, like these companies protected against like the actions of like their workers?
They'll get sued, and then they have to pay off the lawsuits.
Oh, okay.
Or in most cases, they settle.
Is that really?
Yeah, they don't go to court, because that would create precedent. So what they do is they negotiate with the aggrieved party, and they basically negotiate a settlement. But the attorney's still involved, but it doesn't set legal precedent. Like the Harvey Weinstein settlement, that's going to create precedent for sexual harassment and sexual assault in the workforce. That created a precedent.
Yeah.
So they try to avoid precedent. So obviously Harvey could pay off all of the aggrieved parties. They wouldn't take it, they wanted to take them to court. So they wanted to set precedent, and they felt that they could get a higher redress. I don't think it's gone to civil yet. This was a criminal court with Weinstein. Once it goes to civil, he'll probably have to pay, hundreds of $millions in retribution, for his accident. They haven't even gone there yet. And California hasn't sued him yet. So once they get sued, then they'll probably go after him for civil penalties and take everything that he's made, or at least the majority of what he's worth. So after you conduct the economic analysis, then you have to look at the policy to try to address some of these issues. Obviously, we could impose some type of criminal legal standard that basically says if you're gonna, hire these workers, then you're gonna have to do X credit check and X criminal background check under the law. That could be one way of doing it. The other is these gig workers aren't getting paid a lot of money and they don't have a lot of benefits. So how do you cure the labor market problem, the labor market failure due to that? So the first would be collecting information on residents in the gig economy would help to develop better targeted policies to serve those specific constituencies. So we don't have a lot of data on gig workers, okay? So that now we need to collect more data on who these people are. The second is have the technology platform companies provide benefits to them, particularly healthcare. That's what they really want. Create a new category of worker. You gotta be able, under the labor laws, you gotta categorize workers. So if you create a new category, then they have labor rights. So create a new category of worker called the dependent contractor. The company can provide benefits and follow certain regulations if we have this definition. The last is creating portable benefits. Benefits owned by the employees and taken to each new job they have, and the companies contribute based on some kind of prorated amount of the work that they've done. So it's almost like what are those called, a SHA, your healthcare accounts. They're portable. It's almost like a 401k that I have in the company. I can throw it into a self-directed IRA and basically take that money with me as a tax-deferred account. So some kind of policy innovation to try to address some of these issues. So, I don't think we need to go through all the conclusions, because the conclusions were basically the introduction. Okay. What time's this class over? What? 50? Okay. So why don't you, look at that, if you wanna write up, maybe a one page, just some of your comments on it. I'll take that, as part of the exam test. So just, some of the takeaways that you took away from it, so at least you understand the economics around it. From an urban policy standpoint, I think we understand what the impacts were. There's positive and negative impacts on real estate values. Obviously, if tenants and people in your office buildings and your retail can have access very rapidly to lower cost transportation as opposed to going through the taxi industry, they're gonna be better off. And people are gonna come downtown, they're gonna wanna work downtown, they're gonna wanna shop downtown, and the retail stores are gonna generate more gross receipts, and the city's gonna generate more tax revenue. From an owner standpoint, from an office building, if my tenants and my workers within my building have better access to transportation through Uber, then people are gonna wanna be in my building, and I'm gonna be able to charge them higher rent. So there's gonna be some kind of Ricardian rent or some kind of impact on the demand for real estate. The thing that's not taken into consideration is the negative externalities associated with increased congestion and increased pollution. So it's a trade-off between quality of life and economics. So who internalizes the negative externalities? Well, right, the individuals, right, that are gonna have to deal with more congestion, more Uber cars, more cars in the downtown, and higher pollution levels. So there's that negative externality. The positive externality, the negative externality that's being incurred, absorbed, that negative is a positive for the city and a positive for landlords. So basically what you're doing is you're transferring the negative externality to become a positive externality depending on who you are as an agent. So the tenants and the individuals are gonna be incurring the negative externality, which is a cost. And the positive externality from it is gonna be incurred by the landlord and by the city. So the question is, how do you address the issue? So they're thinking about regulating the number of Uber drivers that can actually be in the downtown. In San Francisco, they've eliminated cars from Market Street to address the issue. The buses, Genentech, the Uber, not the Uber, but the Google buses, those buses basically have still been allowed to use the bus lanes, to use the stop-off points, and they've actually created congestion in the downtown too. But they only pay I think $10 a month or $100 a month to basically have access to the downtown. So we're incurring a cost by not having access to public transportation because these buses have taken over the public bus lanes and the public spots, but it brings more workers into the downtown. That increases demand for office space, jacks up rents, jacks up the value of the buildings, and the assessment taxes and the payroll taxes by the city, they get more tax revenue. Okay? I think I'm gonna end it there. Did you guys want me to take a look at any of your stuff? The memos, the articles? Is everybody clear on your paper and what you're doing?
I know.